What would you do if a routine traffic stop revealed a secret from your past? Officer Evan Peterson thought it was just another day on duty, until he noticed the tattoo on her wrist. A symbol he hadn't seen in years. A symbol linked to a tragedy he thought he had left behind. And suddenly, he had the answers he had been searching for all along. The golden light of late afternoon bathed the sky in hues of orange and amber, casting long shadows across the quiet streets. Officer Evan Peterson sat in his patrol car, the hum of the engine blending with the faint rustle of leaves stirred by a warm breeze. The day had been bright, almost deceptively so, but now the sun hung low on the horizon, its rays stretching like fingers over the asphalt. Despite his apparent tranquility, he lived under the pressure of his workload and the tensions of his life as a police officer. It was moments like these that made Evan question why he'd ever chosen this job. The world seemed peaceful under the fading sunlight, yet something about the stillness felt heavy, as if the calm before a storm lingered just beneath the surface. He glanced at the clock on the dashboard, getting ready for another long night shift, when his radar gun chirped. A car sped past, its sleek frame glinting in the sun as it cut through the remnants of puddles from the earlier rain. Evan sighed, flicked on his sirens, and pulled onto the road behind it. The car slowed and eased onto the shoulder, its tires crunching against gravel. Evan stepped out cautiously, his hand resting on the grip of his flashlight. As he approached the driver's side window, it rolled down, revealing a woman in her early 30s. Her sharp features were framed by dark hair tousled from the wind, and though she forced a smile, her eyes betrayed a flicker of panic. "Evening, ma'am," Evan said, his voice calm but firm. "Do you know how fast you were going?" "I'm sorry, officer," she replied, her voice trembling slightly. "I didn't realize." "License and registration, please," he interrupted, his tone leaving no room for argument. She nodded and reached into the glove compartment, her hands shaking as she handed him the documents. Evan took them, studying her face as much as the papers. Something about her unease set off alarms in his head. Years on the force had taught him to trust his instincts, and they were screaming now. "Wait here," he said, turning back toward his patrol car. Inside, he glanced at her license. Grace Davis. The name didn't register, but there was something familiar about her, something he couldn't quite place. He ran her information through the system, his eyes darting between the screen and her car parked ahead. Outside, the sunlight softened further, casting an eerie glow over the scene. Evan's mind wandered, as it often did during shifts like this, back to the case that had haunted him for years. His sister, Sarah, had been murdered when she was just 19. The killer was never caught, and the only clue left behind was a strange tattoo found on a suspect who vanished without a trace. A tattoo Evan had memorized down to the last detail. Shaking off the memory, he stepped back out into the waning light and approached Grace's car. "Everything checks out," he said, handing her back her license. "But I'm going to have to issue you a warning for speeding. Please slow down, especially with the roads still wet." "Thank you, officer," she said, relief evident in her voice. As she reached out to take her license, her sleeve slid up slightly, revealing a small tattoo on her wrist. Evan froze, his breath caught in his throat as his eyes locked onto the intricate design. A swirling symbol he hadn't seen in years. It was the same one from Sarah's case. His heart pounded in his chest as he struggled to keep his composure. "Ma'am," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil raging inside him. "Where did you get that tattoo?" Grace's eyes widened, and she quickly pulled her sleeve down, covering the mark. It's nothing," she stammered. "Just something I got when I was younger." Evan's mind raced. This couldn't be a coincidence. He needed answers, but he couldn't let her see how much this affected him. "Step out of the car, please," he said, his tone leaving no room for argument. Grace hesitated, her gaze darting to the rearview mirror as if weighing her options. But with a resigned sigh, she opened the door and stepped out into the lingering warmth of the evening. The world around them seemed to grow quieter, the golden light of the setting sun casting everything in an almost surreal glow. Evan's focus narrowed to the woman standing before him. This wasn't just a routine stop anymore. This was the moment everything changed. And he had no idea just how deep the secrets went. The warm glow of late afternoon clung stubbornly to the horizon as Evan stood face to face with Grace, the flashing lights of his patrol car casting long shadows that danced across her face. The golden light was beginning to fade, giving way to the deep blues of twilight, but it still illuminated her features enough for him to see the nervous flicker in her eyes. Her jaw was clenched, defiance etched into every line of her expression. "What's this about, officer?" she asked, her voice steady despite the palpable tension hanging in the air. Evan hesitated, his mind racing. He couldn't just accuse her of being connected to his sister's murder without proof. But the tattoo on her wrist was undeniable. It was the same symbol, a swirling, almost hypnotic design that had been burned into his memory for over a decade. "That tattoo," he said, his voice low and measured. "Where did you get it?" Grace crossed her arms, her sleeve still pulled down to cover the mark. "I told you, it's just something I got when I was younger. It doesn't mean anything." "It means something to me," Evan shot back, his composure slipping for just a moment. He took a deep breath, forcing himself to stay calm. "Look, I'm not trying to scare you, but I need to know the truth. That symbol, it's tied to something from my past. Something I can't ignore." Grace's expression softened slightly, but she remained guarded. "What do you mean?" Evan hesitated again. He rarely talked about Sarah, even with people he trusted. But something about this moment made him feel like he had no choice. "My sister," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "She was murdered 12 years ago. The only clue the police ever found was a tattoo like yours on a suspect who disappeared. They never caught him. They never even identified him." Grace's eyes widened, and for a moment, she looked genuinely shocked. But then her expression hardened, and she shook her head. "I'm sorry about your sister, but I had nothing to do with that. I was just a kid when I got this tattoo. It was part of something I was involved in back then. But I left that life behind a long time ago." Evan studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. She seemed sincere, but he couldn't shake the feeling that she was hiding something. "What were you involved in?" he pressed. Grace looked away, her eyes scanning the empty street bathed in the dimming light. The world around them felt suspended between day and night, the air thick with unspoken secrets. "It's complicated," she said finally, "and it's not something I like to talk about." Evan took a step closer, his voice firm but not unkind. "I need you to talk about it. If you're not involved in anything illegal, then you have nothing to worry about. But if you know something that's simple, I need to know." Grace hesitated, her hands trembling as she tucked a strand of wind-tousled hair behind her ear. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "If I tell you, I could be putting myself in danger. And you might not like what you hear." Evan's heart pounded in his chest. The answers he'd been chasing his whole career were almost in sight. But he could see the fear in Grace's eyes, and he knew he had to tread carefully. "I can protect you," he said, his voice steady. "But I need you to trust me." Grace let out a bitter laugh. "Trust you? I don't even know you." "You don't have to know me to know I'm telling the truth," Evan replied. "My sister's killer has been walking free for 12 years. If you know something that could help me find him, I'm begging you to tell me." For a long moment, Grace said nothing. The last rays of sunlight disappeared behind the horizon, leaving them cloaked in the soft glow of twilight. Finally, she sighed and looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "Okay," she said softly. "I'll tell you what I know, but not here. It's not safe." Evan nodded, relief and apprehension flooding through him in equal measure. "Where then?" "There's a diner about 10 minutes from here," she said. "It's open all night. We can talk there." Evan hesitated. Taking her to a public place wasn't standard procedure, but he knew he couldn't force her to talk. And if this was his only chance to get answers, he wasn't about to let it slip away. "All right," he said finally, "but I'm following you, and if you try to run, I will stop you." Grace nodded, her expression unreadable. I'm not running, she said quietly. Not anymore. As she got back into her car, Evan returned to his patrol car, his mind racing. He didn't know what Grace was going to tell him, but he knew one thing for certain. This was no longer just about a speeding ticket. This was about justice, and he was willing to do whatever it took to get it. The diner was a relic of the past, its neon sign flickering weakly against the night. The interior was warm and dimly lit, the smell of coffee and grease hanging in the air. Evan and Grace sat in a corner booth, as far from the few other patrons as possible. The tension between them was palpable, but the diner's quiet hum provided a strange sense of privacy. Evan stirred his coffee absently, his eyes never leaving Grace. She sat across from him, her hands wrapped around a steaming mug of tea, her gaze fixed on the table. The rain had soaked through her jacket, and she looked smaller somehow, more vulnerable than she had on the side of the road. "Start from the beginning," Evan said, his voice low but firm. "Tell me everything." Grace took a deep breath, her fingers tightening around the mug. "I was 16 when I got the tattoo," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was in a bad place back then. My parents were gone and I was living with my aunt, but she didn't care what I did. I fell in with the wrong crowd." Evan nodded, encouraging her to continue. "There was this group," she said, her eyes distant, as if she were reliving the memory. "They called themselves the Crimson Circle. They were into all kinds of illegal stuff, drugs, theft, even blackmail. But they didn't just want money. They wanted power. They wanted control." Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't interrupt. "I was young and stupid," Grace continued, her voice trembling. "I thought they were my family. They gave me food, a place to stay, and the tattoo. It was a mark of loyalty. They said it meant I was one of them forever." "And the symbol?" Evan asked, leaning forward. "What does it mean?" Grace hesitated, her eyes flicking up to meet his. "It's a warning," she said quietly, "to anyone who crosses them, and to anyone who tries to leave." Evan's stomach churned. He had suspected as much, but hearing it confirmed made it all the more real. Did they kill people?" Grace looked away, her face tense. "Yes," she whispered, "but I didn't know that at first. By the time I found out, it was too late. I was in too deep." Evan's mind raced, connecting the dots. "My sister," he said, his voice tight with emotion. "Was she?" Grace's eyes filled with tears, and she shook her head. "I don't know," she said. "I swear I don't know. I wasn't there that night. But I heard rumors. They said someone had betrayed the circle, and they made an example of her. I didn't even know her name until you told me." Evan's hands clenched into fists under the table. He wanted to believe her, but the pain of Sarah's loss was still raw, even after all these years. "If you didn't know her, why are you so scared now?" Grace's voice broke. "Because they're still out there," she said. "And if they find out I'm talking to you, they'll kill me. They'll kill both of us." Evan leaned back, his mind reeling. He had spent years chasing shadows, and now, sitting across from him, was someone who could finally shine a light on the darkness. But that light came with a cost he wasn't sure he was ready to pay. "Why did you leave the circle?" he asked after a long silence. Grace wiped her eyes, her voice steadier now. "I couldn't do it anymore," she said. "I couldn't live like that, so I ran. I changed my name, moved to a new city, and tried to start over. But you can't just walk away from something like that. They'll never let me go." Evan studied her face, searching for any sign of deception. But all he saw was fear and regret. "If you help me," he said slowly, "I can protect you. But I need to know everything. Names, places, anything that can help me bring them down." Grace hesitated, her hands trembling as she reached for her tea. "It's not that simple," she said. "The circle isn't just a gang. It's a network. They have people everywhere. Cops, lawyers, even politicians. If you go after them, you're not just risking your life. You're risking everything." Evan's jaw tightened, but his resolve didn't waver. "I don't care," he said. "They took my sister. They've taken who knows how many others. If I don't stop them, who will? Grace stared at him for a long moment, her eyes searching his. Finally, she nodded. All right, she said quietly. I'll help you. But you need to understand something. What? This isn't just about your sister, she said, her voice grave. This is about survival. And if we're going to do this, we're going to do it my way. No badges, no backup. Just you and me. Evan hesitated, his instincts as a cop warring with his desperation for answers. But in the end, he knew she was right. This was bigger than him. Bigger than both of them. All right, he said finally. We'll do it your way. But if you're lying to me, I'm not. Grace interrupted, her voice firm. I have just as much to lose as you do. Evan nodded, the weight of their agreement settling over him like a heavy blanket. He didn't know what he was getting himself into, but he knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning. The night was already dark when Evan and Grace left the restaurant, and the air was still thick with tension. They drove separately to an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of the city, a place Grace claimed was safe from prying eyes. Evan followed her, his mind racing with a mix of anticipation and unease. He wasn't used to operating outside the law, but he knew this was the only way to get the answers he needed. The warehouse was dark and cavernous, its walls lined with rusted machinery and broken crates. Grace led him to a small office in the back, where a single bulb flickered overhead, casting long shadows across the room. She locked the door behind them and turned to face him, her expression serious. Before we go any further, she said, we need to set some ground rules. Evan crossed his arms, his eyes narrowing. I'm listening. First, she began, no recording devices, no backup, no badges. If you bring the police into this, I'm gone. Second, you do exactly what I say when I say it. This isn't a game, Evan. One wrong move and we're both dead. Evan hesitated, his instincts as a cop screaming at him to take control. But he knew she was right. This wasn't a routine investigation. This was a dangerous, high-stakes game, and Grace was the only one who knew the rules. All right, he said finally. No cops, no badges. But if I think you're leading me into a trap, all bets are off. Grace nodded, her expression unreadable. Fair enough. She moved to a dusty desk in the corner and pulled out a map of the city, spreading it across the surface. Evan stepped closer, his eyes scanning the markings she had made. Circles, lines, and notes scribbled in the margins. The crimson circle operates in layers, she explained, tracing a finger along one of the lines. At the top is the inner circle, the leaders. They're the ones who call the shots. Below them are the enforcers, the ones who carry out their orders. And at the bottom are the recruits, like I was. Most of them don't even know who they're really working for. Evan frowned. How do we get to the top? Grace's lips curved into a faint, humorless smile. We don't. Not directly. The inner circle is untouchable. But if we can take out the enforcers, we can weaken their hold. And if we're lucky, we might find someone who can lead us to the top. Evan studied the map, his mind racing. Where do we start? Grace pointed to a circled area on the map. Here, there's a club downtown called the Black Lotus. It's a front for the circle's operations. If we can get inside, we might be able to gather some intel. Evan raised an eyebrow. And how do you propose we do that? Grace's smile widened, but there was no warmth in it. We play the part. You're going to be my bodyguard and I'm going to be, well, me. A former member looking to make amends. Evan's stomach churned at the thought of walking into a den of criminals, but he knew he didn't have a choice. And if they recognize you? They won't, Grace said confidently. I've been gone for years, and I look different now. But even if they do, that's where you come in. Evan nodded, though his unease only grew. He wasn't sure he trusted Grace, but he trusted his instincts, and right now they were telling him to see this through. When do we move? He asked. Tonight, Grace replied. The sooner, the better. Evan took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. He had spent years chasing shadows, and now he was about to step into the darkness itself. As they left the warehouse and headed for the Black Lotus, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was walking into a trap. But he also knew that this was possibly the only chance to bring his sister's killers to justice. And he was willing to risk everything to make it happen. The Black Lotus was exactly what Evan had expected. A seedy, dimly lit club with thumping bass and a crowd of people who looked like they had something to hide. Grace led the way, her confidence unwavering as they pushed through the crowd. Evan stayed close, his hand resting on the concealed weapon at his side. They were barely inside when a large man in a suit stepped in front of them, his arms crossed. "This is a private club," he said, his voice low and threatening. "You got an invitation?" Grace smiled, her demeanor shifting instantly. She leaned in close, her voice a purr. "Tell Victor that Grace is back. He'll want to see me." The man hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. Then he nodded and stepped aside, pulling out a radio to relay the message. Evan's heart pounded as they were led deeper into the club, his senses on high alert. He didn't know what they were walking into, but he knew one thing for certain. The game had begun. The back room of the Black Lotus was a stark contrast to the chaos of the club. It was quiet, almost eerily so, with plush leather chairs and a large oak desk dominating the space. Behind the desk sat a man in his 50s, his sharp features and cold eyes giving him an air of authority. This was Victor, the enforcer Grace had mentioned. Evan stood slightly behind Grace, his hand still resting near his concealed weapon. He scanned the room, noting the two armed guards by the door and the security cameras in the corners. This was a dangerous place, and he knew they were walking a tightrope. Victor leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he studied Grace. "Grace Davis," he said, his voice smooth but laced with menace. "It's been a long time. I thought you were dead." Grace smiled, though it didn't reach her eyes. "Not dead, Victor. Just away. But I'm back now, and I'm ready to make amends." Victor's gaze flicked to Evan, his expression unreadable. "And who's this?" "My bodyguard," Grace replied smoothly. "I've picked up some powerful enemies over the years. Can't be too careful." Victor chuckled, though there was no humor in it. "You always did have a flair for the dramatic. But let's cut to the chase. Why are you here, Grace? And don't tell me it's just to catch up." Grace stepped forward, her confidence unwavering. "I'm here to offer you a deal. I have information, valuable information, about a rival group moving in on your territory. But I need something in return." Victor raised an eyebrow, clearly intrigued. "Go on." "I want back in," Grace said, her voice firm. "Not as a recruit, as an equal. I've proven my loyalty before, and I can do it again. But I need your word that I'll be protected." Evan's heart pounded as he listened, his mind racing. This was a dangerous game Grace was playing, and he wasn't sure he liked his role in it. But he stayed silent, trusting her to lead the way. Victor leaned forward, his eyes locked on Grace's. "And what makes you think I need your information?" Grace smirked, pulling a flash drive from her pocket and placing it on the desk. "Because if you don't act soon, you're going to lose everything. And we both know the inner circle doesn't tolerate failure." Victor's expression darkened, and for a moment, the room was silent. Then he picked up the flash drive and handed it to one of his guards. "Check it," he ordered. As the guard inserted the drive into a laptop, Evan's unease grew. He didn't know what was on that drive, but he knew it was a gamble, one that could either buy them time or get them killed. After a tense few minutes, the guard nodded. "It's legit. Names, locations, everything." Victor's lips curved into a faint smile, though his eyes remained cold. "You've always been resourceful, Grace. All right, you've got my attention. But if this is a trick—" "It's not," Grace interrupted, her voice steady. "I'm done running, Victor. I want back in, and I'm willing to prove it." Victor studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "All right, you've got your chance. But your bodyguard stays outside. We don't allow outsiders in our meetings." Grace glanced at Evan, her expression unreadable. "He stays with me. He's loyal and he's useful. You'll see." Victor's eyes narrowed, but he didn't argue. "Fine. But if he steps out of line, he's dead. Understood. Evan nodded, though his stomach churned. He didn't like being at Victor's mercy, but he knew this was the only way to get closer to the truth. As they left the office and were led deeper into the club's underbelly, Evan leaned close to Grace, his voice a whisper. "What's on that drive?" "Enough to buy us time," she replied, her eyes forward. "But we need to move fast. Once Victor realizes it's outdated, he'll come after us." Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. He had trusted Grace this far, and he had no choice but to see it through. The next few hours were a blur of meetings and introductions, each one more dangerous than the last. Evan stayed close to Grace, his senses on high alert as they navigated the treacherous world of the Crimson Circle. But as the night wore on, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were running out of time. And when a familiar face appeared in the crowd, a face from his sister's case file, Evan knew the real danger was just beginning. The man's face was etched into Evan's memory, though it had been over a decade since he'd last seen it. It was the same face from the grainy surveillance photo in his sister's case file, the suspect who had vanished without a trace. His name was Nigel Kane, and he was standing just a few feet away, deep in conversation with one of Victor's enforcers. Evan's heart pounded as he fought to keep his composure. He glanced at Grace, who had also noticed Nigel. Her eyes widened slightly, but she quickly masked her surprise, her expression returning to one of cool detachment. "We need to move," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the din of the club. "Now." Evan nodded, his mind racing. They had come here for answers, but he hadn't expected to come face to face with the man who might have killed his sister. He wanted to confront Nigel, to demand the truth, but he knew that would be suicide. Grace grabbed his arm and led him through the crowd, her movements swift and deliberate. They were almost to the exit when a voice called out behind them. "Grace!" They froze, turning to see Victor approaching, his expression unreadable. "Leaving so soon?" he asked, his tone light but laced with suspicion. Grace forced a smile. "Just stepping out for some air. It's been a long night." Victor's eyes narrowed, and he glanced at Evan. "Your bodyguard looks a little jumpy. Everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Grace replied smoothly. "He's just not used to this kind of crowd." Victor studied them for a moment, then nodded. "All right, but don't go far. We have more to discuss." As soon as Victor turned away, Grace and Evan made their way to the exit, their pace quickening as they stepped into the cool night air. "We need to get out of here," Grace said, her voice urgent. "If Nigel recognizes you..." "He won't," Evan interrupted, though his voice lacked conviction. "But we can't leave. Not yet. He's the key to all of this, Grace. If we let him go now, we might never get another chance." Grace's eyes flashed with frustration. "This isn't the time for heroics, Evan. We're outnumbered and outgunned. If we stay, we're dead." Evan hesitated, torn between his desire for justice and the cold, hard reality of their situation. But before he could respond, the sound of shouting erupted from inside the club. "They're onto us," Grace said, her voice tight with fear. "We need to go. Now." Evan nodded, his instincts taking over. They ran to his car, their footsteps echoing in the empty street. But as they reached the vehicle, a figure stepped out of the shadows, blocking their path. It was Nigel. "Going somewhere?" he asked, his voice dripping with menace. Evan's hand went to his weapon, but Nigel was faster, pulling a gun and leveling it at them. "Don't," he warned. "You're not walking away from this." Grace stepped forward, her hands raised. "Nigel, listen to me. This doesn't have to end badly. We can make a deal." Nigel laughed, a cold, humorless sound. "You think I'm stupid, Grace? I know why you're here, and I know who he is." His eyes flicked to Evan. "You're the cop, aren't you? The one who's been sniffing around for years." Evan's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond. Nigel's smile widened. "You want to know what happened to your sister? I'll tell you. She was a loose end, just like you." Evan's vision blurred with rage, but before he could react, Grace lunged at Nigel, knocking the gun from his hand. The two of them struggled, their movements frantic and desperate. Evan moved to help her, but before he could reach them, a shot rang out. Grace stumbled back, clutching her side, her face tight with pain. Nigel smirked, raising the gun again, but Evan was faster. He tackled him to the ground, the two of them grappling for control of the weapon. The fight was brutal and chaotic, each man driven by a desperate need to survive. But in the end, Evan's training gave him the edge. He disarmed Nigel and pinned him to the ground, his hands trembling with rage. "Tell me the truth," he demanded, his voice shaking. "Who killed my sister?" Nigel laughed, blood trickling from the corner of his mouth. "You really think it's that simple? The circle doesn't work like that. Orders come from the top and we carry them out. Your sister was just collateral damage." Evan's heart sank, the weight of Nigel's words crushing him. But before he could respond, the sound of sirens filled the air. Grace groaned, clutching her side as she struggled to her feet. "We need to go," she said, her voice weak but insistent. "The cops will be here any minute." Evan hesitated, his eyes locked on Nigel. He wanted answers, but he knew they were out of time. With a final, frustrated growl, he stood and helped Grace to the car. As they drove away, the sound of sirens grew louder, and Evan couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. They had survived the night, but the cost had been high. And as he glanced at Grace, her face weary and drawn, he knew one thing for certain: the fight for justice was far from finished. There are moments in the past that are never buried, and choices we make that can haunt us forever. How would you act if you were in Evan's position? Would you seek justice, no matter the cost, or would you choose forgiveness, even for those who don't deserve it? And what about Grace, caught between her past and her hope for a better future? Let us know in the comments below. If you enjoyed this emotional roller coaster, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Embrace the Journey for more heartwarming tales.